Thank you once again. We now shift continents. We now go to Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta with a presentation by Laurel Larsen titled Multi-Benefit Science-Informed Management of California, Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta in a Changing Climate. Laurel, floor is yours, 25 minutes.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this meeting. So today I'm going to be highlighting the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is a slightly different delta from many of the others that we're considering in this meeting, in the sense that it's an inverted delta. So it forms as a result of the funneling of tidal energy through the Carquinez Strait here, which is this bedrock constriction, and then that tidal energy flows into the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Valley, where these two major rivers come together. Despite the fact that it's an inverted delta, though, it faces many of the same issues of the other deltas that we are considering throughout this meeting. And today I'll just say, I'll give you a bit of background on this delta, but I'm really going to be focusing my talk on science governance and what works and what doesn't work in science governance from my perspective as the Delta lead scientist for 3 years. So the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is often considered to be the heart of California, which I think is an appropriate analogy because it's where water from these distal parts of the state flows in and mixes, and then is actually literally pumped out to other distal regions of the state. And you can see receiving areas of the state in the tan color. Let me go back up. Oh, there we go. Too far.
Okay. Pointer doesn't work on that screen.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. I thought I saw a little bit of a laser. The water in California is also the state's lifeblood, as it is in many places. The Delta's water supplies fresh water to about 45% of the fruits and vegetables grown in the United States, not just in California. And it also sustains commercially and ecologically and culturally important salmon fishery. Culturally, it sustains a rich way of life, both for the generations of farmers who have made a living in the Delta, but even before that, where the Miwok and the Maidu tribes, who still very much value the Delta and its resources, even though they've been displaced. Tribes throughout Northern California value the Delta as well for sustaining salmon, which is very important to them culturally. Like many of the other deltas that we're covering in this meeting, though, our delta faces many challenges. These challenges include things like massive fishery declines, challenges associated with climate change, including both increasing drought risk and increasing flood risk. We're facing rising sea levels that are pushing salinity into the delta as well. And flooding is exacerbated through land subsidence, which is something we've heard about in the Mekong River Delta. In the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, it's because most of the land is peat. And when islands have been drained for farms, that peat subsides over time. We face water quality challenges, including growing incidence of harmful algal blooms. There are legacy mercury problems associated with the gold mining era. And this last one is a social challenge that really is important and going from the planning to implementation phase, which is a legacy of exploitative governance within the Delta and many of the social challenges that incurs. So our tribal communities were forced out of the Delta, and for a long time, their beneficial uses of the Delta have been excluded from policy planning processes. And even if you just consider the people who are living in the Delta now, there's often a perception that in the policy sphere, the interests of Southern California are favored over the interests of residents within the Delta. So the Delta is faced with many types of conflicts that have gone on for decades, but continue to this day. And these are just some recent headlines that come from whitehouse.gov as well as a number of other media sources. One of the ongoing challenges is a proposal to convey water directly from the Sacramento River around the Delta and into the conveyance system that brings water to Southern California. There have been proposals for this ever since the 1970s, and they remain highly controversial. The role of science in these conflicts has also been prominent. For decades, the Delta was engaged in an era of what many people call combat science, where there was a perception that individual agencies with specific mandates for managing water or water quality, or industry even, would cherry pick the science in order to advance their political or economic agendas. A lot of people now say we're coming out of the era of combat science, but combat science has created a legacy of mistrust in science that we're trying to now overcome. And that's one of the things that I think is really important that I'll keep coming back to through this talk. The other thing that I think is important to set the stage for this talk is just the fact that institutional governance within the Delta is really complex, even in comparison to other large coastal ecosystems in the US, like the Chesapeake Bay or the Everglades. So in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, we literally have a constellation of state and federal agencies who are engaged in governance, as well as actors from the private and non-governmental sector who have an influence over how science is used in the governance process. Many of the state and federal agencies do have narrow and focused mandates. For example, we have a state agency and a federal agency focused on managing water supply, a state and federal agency each focused on managing water quality, another pair focused on management of fish and wildlife resources, and another pair focused on really managing the science in a way that is supposed to be divorced from political agendas. The governance structure that we have now evolved iteratively as well, building on past successes, but then also undergoing punctuated restructuring in times of failure. The latest incarnation of science governance that I'll talk about came about with the 2009 Delta Reform Act, which combined elements of science governance that worked previously with a new structure. And so some of the elements that the Delta Reform Act enshrined in law were having this Delta Independent Science Board and a Delta Science Program. Sorry, I can't find my cursor. Hopefully you can see them. And a Delta Science Program as independent or semi-independent entities performing and reviewing the science that goes into management of this system. But there's a really unique structure that integrates state, federal, independent, and collaborative entities here. So the Delta Reform Act created the Delta Stewardship Council as a state agency tasked with developing a Delta plan and then administering that plan. That plan is actually implemented by a collaborative multi-agency Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. The Delta Independent Science Board reports to the Stewardship Council, but is not controlled by the Stewardship Council. They independently develop an agenda to review the relevant science underlying policy decisions. The Delta Science Program is under the umbrella of the Delta Stewardship Council, but it's designed to have some independence, in part through the appointment of a federally funded Delta lead scientist who often comes from outside government. For example, I came from UC Berkeley when I was within that role. So this is a really unique structure, and I'm going to be talking about some aspects of this that work and some aspects of this that didn't work so well. So let me start with some success stories here. And one is I am a big fan of independent or at least semi-independent science venues for performing cross-cutting science functions. So in our Delta, we have great scientists that are embedded within these state and federal agencies, but their time is very restricted. And they're often very focused on dealing with the latest emergency, whether that's a drought or a flood emergency or a political emergency. And so there are some things that fall through the gaps, mainly related to the use of science in long-term strategic planning, or synthesis activities that cut across individual agency missions and mandates. And so having these functions housed in an entity like the Delta Science Program, I think is very effective. So these are some of the functions that the science program performed, along with the Delta Independent Science Board, which really was had a main emphasis on independent peer review. But the science program provided long-term science funding. It catalyzed collaborative science focused on particular topics, such as adaptive management. And I'd say one of the big successes in terms of collaborative science was focused on adaptive management support, as Jennifer talked about a little bit earlier. Science synthesis is another important function, which took the form of organizing topical workshops, but then also putting out a periodic State of Bay Delta Science, which you could see there in the lower right. They communicate science to lawmakers, to agencies, to the general public, and to academic scientists as well. And then this strategic planning was another function. And this takes the form of developing a Delta Science plan, which describes how we do science, what are our protocols, and then a science action agenda, which prioritizes topics that the agencies collectively agree to fund over the 5-year planning horizon. So the other success stories that I'm going to talk about today really fall under the umbrella of what's known as post-normal science. This might be a new term to some of you, but it's science at the policymaking interface that deals with high-stakes decision-making under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Post-normal science has several best practices, including best practices around how we quantify and describe and communicate that uncertainty, how we incorporate it into decision-making. And then it also recognizes that many times there's not a single scientific truth that comes into play in decision-making. Rather, multiple ways of knowing are recognized, and there are procedures for integrating science with values. So I'm going to highlight a few examples of where this is working, where these best practices are showing up in our Delta. And one comes from the Department of Water Resources' recent Delivery Capability Report, which uses an approach that looks beyond individual scenarios that come out of climate models in order to make future projections about water resources. Now, I think climate models are often seen as kind of a gold standard for making these projections, but we do know that they may underestimate the extremes that are plausible for the future. And so one example of working with that uncertainty is to adopt a decision scaling approach, where rather than looking at specific global climate model scenarios, you're looking over a range of plausible changes in temperature and changes in precipitation. The Department of Water Resources used a statistical stochastic weather generator in order to generate climate traces, which were then run through hydrologic models and water systems models to make the projections that you see here about likely future inflows to the Delta from the 8 major rivers that feed it. And what you could see is that all compared to the current conditions, all of these projections are fairly dire, particularly as you look at the extremes. But it's really important to be aware of this for planning processes. So I mentioned that integration of science with values is another important tool under the umbrella of post-normal science. And one example that I'd like to highlight here also comes from the Department of Water Resources, which has adopted the use of a structured decision-making approach in order to make come up with season-ahead plans for the management of the Delta smelt, which is that critically endangered species in the Delta that the White House has been very vocal about in the recent year. But the reality with the Delta smelt is that there is a particular time of year where its survival is most threatened. And there are a number of different management actions that can be taken to enhance its likelihood of survival during that time of year. And this includes releasing water through the productive marshes of the northern Delta. And that water might come from agricultural drain water, or it might come from reservoir releases that are funneled down the Sacramento deepwater shipping channel. We could also control salinity. They're very sensitive to salinity. So we could control salinity using salinity control gates in the Sassoon Marsh. But to make decisions about how to best utilize these resources, which have trade-offs for many different sectors in the Delta, the Department of Water Resources convenes a coordination group annually that works very closely with some technical working groups to use conceptual models and numerical models to evaluate the potential outcomes of these different management levers under different seasonal conditions. We have critically dry, and below normal shown here. And then they rate those outcomes for different sectors, agricultural, economic, and so on, in order to make a recommendation to the Department of Water Resources, which they then adopt. And I'll say that just circling back to the peer review function, the independent peer review function, the Department of Water Resources approached the Delta Science Program towards the end of my tenure and asked us to convene a peer review panel to evaluate how science and how this structured decision-making plan was being implemented and come up with recommendations. A few other success stories. One is that there's a growing focus on equitable policy. Many agencies have recently hired tribal engagement liaisons who have gone a long way to form relationships with formerly marginalized tribes. There has been much more recognition of dimensions of equity and justice and how those impact policy, even to the point of some agencies developing equity action plans. But there's also been a lot of education of their staff on these dimensions. And then the other thing I'll mention is that there's been a big emphasis on co-production of knowledge in the planning process. And so co-production involves engaging multiple parties who have interest in the outcomes of a water management decision and working together to develop different scenarios and then use modeling or qualitative approaches to evaluate the outcome of those scenarios. And so some examples of how co-production is being used are the ones that I'm showing here. I could go into more detail in the question and answer session, but I will say that not just in our system, but in many other systems like the Everglades, there have been studies that suggest that co-production processes might take more time and money at the outset of the planning process, but can actually be efficient in terms of the long-term life cycle of plan to implement, because they might reduce the threat of litigation later on and build support and trust in a particular policy. So some ways that this is being used in our system are that a structured decision-making approach is being used in a reorienting to salmon recovery project. And this project has been really successful. It has brought together people who have been at battle with each other for a number of years and actually created relationships between them and a common will to work forward towards a solution. The other two examples on the top here are both focused on salinity management at different scales. I'll return to them. The Collaboratory for Equity in Water Allocations is an ongoing project that is focused on basin scale management of water supply and drinking water and salmon. So there's really a focus on multiple benefits and equity. The Delta Science Action Agenda, which is this document that prioritizes science for funding, is one that was also co-produced with the engagement of many agency scientists, but also with the general public. Now, I am going to kind of segue into the lessons learned, and I'm going to start doing that on this slide. So the thing I'd like to talk about in a little more detail is this Frank's Tract Futures project, which is a project that's focused on salinity management for the Delta. That dark open area that you see in the center is a flooded island in the central Delta where a lot of mixing occurs. And this island receives an input of tidal energy, and it ends up being really important in regulating the salinity of the water that eventually is exported to Southern California. It's become increasingly problematic in terms of its inability to deal with saltwater intrusion, but it's also an area that's really prized for recreational purposes. There are something like 360 bass fishing tournaments here every year. And so initially, people were very resistant to any change in how this part of the landscape is managed. But after a project that brought multiple communities together, there was massive support that was built for a green infrastructure solution, salinity penetration into the Delta, while creating new recreational opportunities such as kayaking, while maintaining existing uses. However, the lesson learned here is that despite the fact that everyone was supportive of this project, it still hasn't been funded to this day. And so there's a challenge sometimes in translating these solutions into action. And I think there's a danger when we're unable to do that because they are such an investment. Okay, so some other lessons learned, and this will be the final part of my talk. I'll start with a lesson learned, which is that when you have an institutional governance structure like the Delta, individual agencies and actors with very specific policy mandates can be very effective at doing what they do, but there are things that fall between the cracks, and collaborative governance venues and boundary entities can be very effective at fulfilling those gaps. But they're most effective when they enhance efficiencies, so they help agencies achieve their missions, or fulfill cross-cutting needs. And I have a list here. Some of these are wish list items for the Delta. Some of them are items that are actually happening. So we talked about how adaptive management and well, more adaptive management than monitoring best practices, but how adaptive management has been very successfully advanced through collaborative venues in the Delta. Another one is open data repository. So California has an open data portal where all types of environmental data can be deposited. A wish list item related to that would be having more technical support for agency scientists to make that data actually human readable and reproducible. And on a related note, the Delta Science Program is currently advancing this idea of a modeling collaboratory, which we see as a great need within the system. So there's a need for common climate traces, for example, that will be run through planning models. There's a need for common sea level rise projections. And there's a need to do model intercomparisons as well. For example, the two agencies that deal with water supply and water quality each use different water systems models that are updated at different rates. And this can create some tensions in the policy arena. Functions that are performed very well already are integrative science support, synthesis, planning, and peer review. And then the final wish list item that I would highlight is maybe it would be useful to establish a boundary organization focused on social engagement. Because although we've made great strides in equity, in advancing equity, one of the challenges is that tribal members now are being asked to testify multiple times before multiple agencies, often on the same type of thing. And it is exhausting for them. So if there was a way to centralize that process of engagement and trust building, I think that would be beneficial. So I'm going to conclude with some challenging tensions that I'd like to discuss in our discussion period, Guillermo willing, after lunch. I don't have great answers to these tensions. I have some ideas on how they could be mitigated, but I think these would be great to discuss. And I think these aren't just unique to our Delta, but to many of the Deltas that we're collectively considering. And one is this tension between the short timescale on which politics happen and funding cycles usually happen versus the long timescale of collaborative relationship building, of building trust, particularly with marginalized communities, and doing quality science. And so one antidote might be these boundary organizations like the science boundary organizations that are more focused on long-term needs. But the other thing that I think should be recognized is that our power structures have an opportunity to be more inclusive. So for example, we can engage with these communities through co-production, but at the end of the day, these community members often don't hold positions of power. They don't sit on the governing boards. And so if we could designate positions for marginalized communities on these boards, that might be one potential antidote here. Another challenging tension is this tension between the fact that we need policy actors to be highly engaged with the development of collaborative and independent solutions, and actually to take those solutions and implement them. But we don't want them to bias those processes either. So many times, boundary organizations or collaborative groups need to be invested in terms of staff time and money by the policy actors, by the agencies, but not be unduly influenced by them. So what are some antidotes? One might be shared and clear expectations on how policy actors should invest in terms of their time and money, having clear procedures for conflict and bias curtailment, and then to have all of this transparently written up. And I actually think the Delta Science Plan does a good job of establishing some of these procedures that are used to avoid bias and maintain independence in both the peer review process and in the process of reviewing applications for funding. And so that could be a good example. Another is a tension between the need to consistently enforce regulations, but also have those regulations be flexible in a changing climate. And so the example that comes to mind here is the management of delta for salinity. We have salinity standards within the delta, but often those salinity standards are relaxed by the State Water Resources Control Board in times of drought. And this does have an inhibitory effect for the development and maintenance of trust. Similarly, there are proposals in play to curtail the water that is made available to senior water rights holders in favor of meeting environmental regulations. And what I've heard from all these communities is that water users are willing to accept reductions in either water quality or quantity if they can expect when and by how much those reductions are to occur. So some antidotes might be having contingency plans built into regulations and having those decided in advance before it is an emergency. And then this is the last challenge slide I have that highlights what I see as some of the most difficult challenges to navigate in our system. And one is that we're in a process of transitioning from narrow and rigid regulatory structures to hopefully more flexible, anticipatory, and holistic protections. Our strongest environmental protections now are oriented around specific species through the Endangered Species Act. That may be in danger in the current political climate, or if climate change causes some of these species to go locally or globally extinct, we'll be left without those protections. And so this is something that we need to anticipate. This is also coming into play as the community struggles to develop a monitoring and regulatory strategy for harmful algal blooms, which go beyond constituents that have been monitored in the past. And then finally, we have this generational trauma from a legacy of exploitative governance. And what we've been finding through our co-production efforts is that it's very helpful to hold time for storytelling, for people to tell how they've been affected by the legacy of decision-making in the past. And there's a healing process that comes from holding that time. So I'm being told to stop. So I'll go through these recommendations quickly, but prioritize inclusivity, recognizing that this takes time. Develop mechanisms for inclusivity at the highest levels of leadership, and hold space and time for storytelling and active listening, learning from each other, not just holding up scientists and policymakers as the experts. Establish and maintain independent collaborative venues and boundary organizations that can enhance efficiencies, facilitate trust building, anticipate long-term needs, and provide long-term continuity. And I'll say one of our struggles within the Delta Science program has been that we are attached to this policy-making body. I think this is something I've seen inhibit the formation of trust. So consider making those science entities truly independent. And then policy should be flexible and holistic, but consistently enforced. Plan for contingencies. Integrate decision-making under deep uncertainty into policy planning. And then navigate inherent tensions through transparency. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Laurel.